So Jane O'Neill is the founder of Culturally Curious, an arts education consulting firm specializing in art appreciation programs. She curates, and delivers programs throughout New England and beyond. O'Neill holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Hampshire, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Curry Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Jane. Take it away.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you everybody for taking time out of your day today to learn a little bit more about Botticelli. And for the next hour, we basically get a free trip to Italy. We're going to Florence. We're going to be traveling essentially through the galleries of the Uffizi, looking at some of this artist's greatest works. So we will be reveling in these images from this early Italian master, and we will be considering what makes his works unusual, enduring, exceptional, and sometimes even confounding. We'll also take a look at how Botticelli's work changes dramatically in the last decade or so of his life when there is this religious and cultural upheaval in Florence, known as the Bonfire of the Vanities. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll be using this next hour of our time together. Gorgeous image that we'll be getting to later. First, the birth of Venus, and then this is a detail from Primavera. We'll be talking about all of these things a little bit more in depth. So we're going to start off with a very quick introduction to the artist, because we don't know that much about him personally, but we do know a lot about the times in which he was living and working. Then we'll turn our attention to some of his early religious works and his efforts at the Sistine Chapel. And then this next section is called Beauty and Virtue, but it should really be called Blonde Bombshells, because Botticelli knows how to make the ladies gorgeous. And we'll finish up with the Bonfire of the Vanities and the artist's legacy. So lots to cover. Let's dive right into the life and times of Sandro Botticelli. Who was Sandro Botticelli? First of all, his actual name was Alessandro di Mariano Filippetti. And he was born around 1444. We're not totally sure, but he lived until 1510. So he was probably about 65 years old when he passed away. Now, he was an Italian, specifically a Florentine painter, illustrator, engraver, and he was noted for these really sort of graceful outlines that you can see in an image like this, and his mythological and religious paintings. Now, what we're looking at here on the right is purportedly a self-portrait of the artist from his large work over here of the Adoration of the Magi, sort of a nativity scene unfolding here. And he's added himself as one of the witnesses alongside many other contemporary figures from Florence at the time. So this image was painted in 1475, right as Botticelli's about 30 years old and his career is just taking off. So I think if this is him in a self-portrait, he's looking awfully confident. And that's well-deserved confidence too, I should add. Now, what we know about him personally is that Botticelli never married. He was sort of married to his job in many ways. He lived with his family throughout his entire life. In fact, the name Botticelli, there's a couple of different ideas in terms of where it came from, because it's not his given name. One idea is that it's a nickname meaning little barrel. Apparently, it was a nickname given to his brother because his brother was this stout little guy. Botticelli took it on as his own. There's another biographer named Vasari who said that it was the name of a local goldsmith where Botticelli, the artist, may have apprenticed. So we'll never know, but it's a great name and it's so fun to say. So Botticelli grew up in Florence and he stayed in the same neighborhood his entire life. We're looking at a bird's eye view of Florence that was created right around the year 1493. So it sort of gives us a sense in terms of how densely packed the city was. And even though we don't know the exact date when Botticelli was born. What we do know is that he was born at the right time, because what was happening in Florence at this period, it was this incredible blossoming of this artistic, humanistic, technological, and scientific thinking. The world was changing. This would be the equivalent of living in Silicon Valley, right at the beginning of the tech bubble. And he was, right there at the center of it. And this flowering, this blossoming, this rebirth is known as the Renaissance, of course. And he is right there in the heart of it. So another really important person in Florence and in Botticelli's life is a man by the name of Lorenzo de' Medici. We're not going to get too deep into the Medicis for our program tonight, but it's worth noting that the Medici family, which was a very prominent, powerful family in Florence, they were originally bankers and sort of spread out their influence in the arts and politics and in other ways. Lorenzo de' Medici in particular was known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. He was a humanist, he was a scholar, and he would sort of take artists under his wing and sort of support their careers. Botticelli was apparently one of his favorite artists. So having the secured patronage from Lorenzo the Magnificent really helped to secure Botticelli's future and his success. We'll be getting back to Lorenzo a little while later, so that's why I wanted to introduce him quickly here. Generally speaking, you can't talk about Florence during the Renaissance without mentioning the Medicis. So the other aspect of the Renaissance that I wanted to just make sure people were familiar with is this idea that that the Italian Renaissance encapsulates this renewed appreciation for the classical past. And that includes everything from texts to paintings to sculptures to monuments. So all of this work was being done to rediscover the classical past. And that meant excavations, it meant digs. And people were literally pulling these sculptures out of the ground, these fragments of sarcophagi and draped figures like you see here, torsos, just these pieces, and like making sculpture gardens out of them. These are two engravings from right around 1500. So you can see that there's this real appreciation for the kind of design and particularly the realism bordering on idealism that you see in both of these images. Incidentally, in this image, you see a depiction of Michelangelo's famous early work of Bacchus, which he created to look like a sculpture from the classical past. But it's really all about these Italians going crazy for what Italians had been doing about 1500 years earlier. All right, so in addition to sculpture, there's also this renewed appreciation for monuments and architecture. So we're looking at two images of classical monuments from that were created in Rome. This is the Arch of Titus. This is the Arch of Constantine over here. And during the Middle Ages, I mean, these monuments weren't treated like rare and wonderful works of art or architecture. They were just part of the noise of living in the city, basically. So there were ramparts that were built up around them. These were densely packed cities. The monuments themselves were sort of falling apart, and it was all in the noise. But when it came time for the Renaissance, that was when artists and historians and the populace in general became really interested in what people from the classical past had built. So now we see monuments like the Arch of Titus sitting in sort of splendid isolation because we appreciate what it signifies and why it was built. And that appreciation really began right around the time that Botticelli started working. So in the midst of this kind of incredible cultural and intellectual shift that he is living through, Botticelli is receiving this excellent artistic training from an older artist named Fra Filippo Lippi. And we can see a self-portrait of Fra Filippo Lippi over here. I just love that name. Now, Fra, he was a friar, he was a priest, and that's a good reminder to us that many of the artists that were working at this time were also leaders in the church, because almost all of the artwork was done in service for the church. So it made sense to be very aware and very well informed about church doctrine. But Fra Filippo Lippi, he just couldn't really abide by the rules, and he was known to have run off and abducted a beautiful nun who he then later impregnated, and their illegitimate son became an artist himself and trained under Botticelli. But over here on the right, we can see in this gorgeous Madonna and Child with Angels an example of Fra Filippo Lippi's work. And it gives us a little preview for what we're going to see in some of Botticelli's work. This is really one of the most remarkable paintings from, it's right from around 1460. And you can see he's creating this illusion of 3 dimensions, how the Madonna here is sort of coming outside of the frame. He's engaging us, the viewer, with this little angel who's looking out at us. But the Madonna is stunningly beautiful, and she is serene, maybe even a little more morose, in the sense that she seems to understand what the fate of her child will be. So after Botticelli receives this excellent training, he comes out from underneath his master, and he's operating his own studio by 1470. So he's a young upstart, and he gets this commission to depict the virtue of fortitude. And it was going to be part of a series of virtues that were painted by other artists, but he gets fortitude, and it was going to be in essentially what was a financial court right in the town hall in Florence. So it was going to have a lot of eyes on it. So this is his first masterwork as an independent artist. And what we're seeing here is really, in so many ways, resting on the shoulders of the kind of art that was created before it. And even though we're looking at an allegorical figure here, Botticelli is really thinking about religious precedents. And of course, because the church was so powerful and so influential in the world of art, religious precedents would really be all that he knows. But in this case, he's maybe thinking of images of the Madonna and Child enthroned from virtually 100 years earlier. This is a painting by the artist Giugio. But notice how the Madonna's body is this long torso and this kind of short little lap. Notice too how her throne sort of projects out into our space, giving us a sense of 3-dimensionality. We see the exact same thing over here with Fortitude, but instead of holding a baby, instead of holding the Christ child, she's holding a scepter. You could read a lot into this expression, this pose. She has this sideways downcast expression. She doesn't exactly seem like the image of strength, does she? But instead she seems like somebody who's maybe seen a lot and has experienced a lot and is still strong despite that. Now, if we zoom in on some of the details of Fortitude here, you can see this incredible detail in the armor that she's wearing. And that speaks to the fact that Botticelli most likely apprenticed under a goldsmith at some point during his education. And so that's how we get, these wonderful flourishes here in the armor. All right. So to round out this quick introduction to the artist, I just wanted to show you the museum, the Uffizi, which is really translates to the offices, but it's really one of the most preeminent art museums in the entire world. And it's right there in Florence, like a stone's throw away from the neighborhood that Botticelli grew up in and essentially never left. And these days, there are dozens of his paintings at the Uffizi. So like I said, tonight it's like we're traveling to Florence and we're going to get to see so many of these paintings. All right, and if you haven't done so already, you might want to add this to your bucket list. Okay, so let's turn our attention to some of the early religious works that Botticelli was creating, because we'll see they really lay the foundation for compositions and subjects he'll be taking up throughout his career. So this first image here is known as the Pala di Sant'Ambrogio, and it's an example of what art historians call the Sacra Conversazione, So I'm just going to say it in the English way. It's the sacred conversation, a conversation amongst the divine with Mary and various saints. And this is a popular type of altarpiece. And oftentimes people would commission these types of works with saints or patron saints related to their families. So in this case, we know that the patron saints down below are related to the Medicis, because they represent doctors and pharmacists, and of course the name Medici means medicine. So let's take a look at what Botticelli is presenting us here in this work from 1472. Still a very early work for him. It's tempera paint, and this is at the Uffizi. So we are seeing the Madonna enthroned, sort of like Fortitude that we just saw before, with this very long torso. She functions as a throne for the Christ child, who looks out directly at us, engages us, the viewer, in the picture, as does one of the patron saints over here. Notice too the linear perspective, the use of linear perspective to create a rational space for all of these saints to be occupying. The little arch over the head of the Madonna here reinforces that notion of a crown or a halo on her head. And you can just very faintly see that. So some of these saints include Mary Magdalene, John the Baptist, St. Francis of Assisi, and St. Catherine. We can see them here with various attributes that speak to their lives or their martyrdom. St. Catherine was broken on the wheel, as you can see here. So this gives us a sense of the kind of organization of a very popular style, something that was in demand, that Botticelli will go back to several times over the course of his career. Within the space of a few years, this is from 1487, we see his style get even more elegant, and we see a Sakura Conversazione here get even more elaborate. We're up to 12 figures in this scene now, and everybody seems incredibly stylish and delicate. The architecture is more elaborate. Look at how the Madonna is sitting up on an even higher throne here, that the architecture projects around her. There's a scallop shell over her head. She is surrounded by winged angels that hold the instruments of the Christ child's, or Jesus's, martyrdom. And then there are various saints down below. So there's more of a hierarchy here, more sort of visual organization, and so much visual splendor to something like this. So one last sacred conversation I'm going to share with you is the San Bernard Altarpiece, which is from 1487. Almost all of these works are at the Uffizi. And here we see he's pared down the number of saints and angels here, but he's giving us a brand new setting. And this is a little taste of what we'll see when he starts exploring mythology in his works. Here he's using the natural world and the foliage to suggest the architecture that would reinforce the divinity of these characters. So we almost get like architectural niches over each of their heads, but it's made out of plants, and the plants are very highly detailed. So it's really kind of fun to kind of zoom in here on some of the details surrounding Mary, who is in the process of feeding the Christ child. He's reaching up to her, but also looking out at us. Surrounding her are these white lilies that speak to her purity, her chastity. So this is a painting that's filled with these details of the natural world. It's a real shift in terms of his interests when it comes to this type of composition. Now, in addition to these sacred conversations, Botticelli was known to have created various or a number of depictions of the Annunciation, which has always been sort of a soft spot for me in the entire history of art. I love these scenes where Mary is being told that she is divinely pregnant. I always sort of project myself into Mary at this moment. How would I react if I got that news? And in this moment, which Botticelli painted in 1481. And I should mention that the colors here are a little bit muted because this is a fresco painting, which means it's painted directly into wet plaster. So, so we tend to get more muted colors. This is a 20-foot long painting. In this fresco, we can see the angel Gabriel coming into this portico in a Renaissance style palace and speaking this news to Mary, who is already on her knees praying. And what I love here is that the news, this divine message, is communicated via these golden rays, these straight lines emanating from well, from Gabriel, but actually probably from just behind Gabriel. It's actually like the word of God coming through, but he's hovering in the air, and he holds himself with his hands, and Mary is doing, it seems like she's about to do something similar with her hands. So it's this interesting giving and receiving in terms of the posturing here. Just beyond this Renaissance palace, there's an enclosed garden, and that would have been symbolic of Mary's purity. So Botticelli takes up this subject again. This is a later version from 1490. It's also at the Uffizi, and it's a tighter composition. It's a smaller work. There's almost no furniture. It's all about the communication of this message. The angel Gabriel comes into this room to tell Mary that she's divinely pregnant. He's sort of crouching, cowering here. He's holding that white lily that symbolizes her purity. And she is in the process of praying, but she's not on her knees. And she has this kind of interesting, kind of torqued reaction to this. Her body's twisting and her wrists are flexed. And I think you can make a lot out of that gesture. As he is giving news and she is receiving that news, he sort of reinforces it by the lines of the architecture just beyond it. Whenever I look at this, I sort of get chills because I feel like it is a little bit of Michelangelo before Michelangelo here. This would have predated the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel by about 20 years or so. But it's a really interesting way to be a storyteller through poses and gestures. And we certainly see Michelangelo capitalize on that in the years to come. So this might be a good segue to the Sistine Chapel. Now, a lot of people associate the Sistine Chapel with Michelangelo, rightfully so. He, of course, painted this incredible fresco on the ceiling. But before Michelangelo ever even got to the Sistine Chapel, Botticelli was called there by Pope Sixtus IV. The year was 1481. And a number of leading early Renaissance artists were called to create these massive fresco paintings on sort of the upper register of the walls of the Sistine Chapel. So at this time, the ceiling is just blue sky with stars. There's no Michelangelo yet. The walls down below are painted swag drapery, and these early Renaissance masters, including Perugino, Botticelli, and others, were painting these large-scale depictions of the life of Christ and Moses and others. These paintings are about 12 to 13 feet high, and oftentimes about 20 feet across. Now Botticelli, and I should mention, they are completely overshadowed today by Michelangelo's work. Basically, nobody even cares that they're there, and they are still there. But Michelangelo sort of rules the roost when it comes to the Sistine Chapel. So let's take a quick look at what Botticelli contributed to this impressive building and this impressive cycle of murals. He had 3 paintings in particular, and I think with this first painting, which is called The Temptations of Christ, we can see how complicated his composition is here. Now there's a lot of storytelling that's happening, and I'm going to reduce it down to very simple terms so that we can understand it quickly. But essentially we have 3 different scenarios where Christ is being tempted by the devil. And we can see him sort of up at the top and read that from left to right. This is typical early Renaissance storytelling where you include multiple scenes within one frame. So it's not like modern day cartoons where you would block it off in different panels. In the foreground, we have a leper that Christ had healed, who is going through this kind of cleansing ceremony. But when all is said and done, there's more more than 50 people included in this one scene. I'm sure many people paid to have their portraits included, but Botticelli is trying to cram sort of as much information as possible into this massive painting. Now, right across the way is another painting by Botticelli, which includes scenes from the life of Moses. And this is very intentional in terms of its placement, because they're trying to draw the papacy really was trying to draw this parallel between the life of Christ and the life of Moses. It was drawing a direct connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And when you do that, you can then draw a connection between Jesus and Peter, the first pope, and it helps to legitimize the papacy, really. So Moses, Jesus, Pope, and it's all good in the Sistine Chapel. So with this work, Botticelli's doing a lot of the same things that we've seen so far. He's telling various stories of the life of Moses, repeating him in the same clothes, this kind of golden robe and green toga, throughout the picture, and giving us this kind of snapshots of the stories of the life of Moses here. I won't spend too much time here, but it just gives you a sense of his storytelling and how his focus is really on the body and on poses, and he sort of stylizes everything else, including the trees here. But with this last painting from the Sistine Chapel, you can see that Botticelli is spending a little bit of time in Rome, and he's internalizing this new appreciation in the Renaissance of the classical past. So what dominates this last painting that I'm showing you is this massive ancient triumphal arch here, which would have been directly inspired by the Arch of Constantine, which dates to about the year 300. So Botticelli's painting in the Sistine Chapel, but he's going around through Rome in his downtime and just in awe of what he's seeing there. So really impressive storytelling on a large scale, painted in fresco, which is sort of outside of his wheelhouse. Botticelli is really just crushing it at this point in his career. So let's turn our attention to the blonde bombshells, beauty and virtue. Now, for the most part, we're going to be talking about devotional works and mythological works here, because in addition to telling these religious stories, depicting saints, Botticelli would create these kind of intimate portrayals of the Madonna and the Christ child. These are known as devotional works. You might even have something like this in your home to contemplate, to pray in front of. And what Botticelli does is he makes these
just like censorship.
He makes these depictions absolutely stunningly gorgeous. So let's do a little quick comparison between what he's doing and what his mentor Fra Filippo Lippi did. So Fra Filippo Lippi is relying on a great deal of naturalism in showing the beauty of the Madonna over here. She is, without question, absolutely beautiful. But you could make the case that Botticelli is pushing beauty to a whole new level, that she is not a natural beauty of our world. Now the Madonna is a stylized, otherworldly beauty. You could almost make the case that that showing her as a natural beauty would be denigrating her. To show her as an otherworldly beauty is to make her divine. So this is sort of like Photoshop for the 15th century. This is a way to really to elevate her status, to really show her as the queen of heaven. And this is done so effectively here, not just with the way he's portrayed her very elegant features and her proportions here, but with all of the gold as well. So his depictions of the Madonna, and there are so many of them. In fact, it was really hard to choose which images to show tonight. But I think this one that's known as the Madonna of the book is a great one to look at. This one is at the Poldi Pizzoli Museum in Milan. It was painted in 1483. So what he's essentially doing is creating depictions of the Madonna that are so beautiful and so captivating. I would equate them to the kinds of images we see on the covers of tabloid magazines in the checkout aisle at the grocery store, the kinds of images that you can't take your eyes off of because they are so perfect. Perhaps his best known depiction of a beautiful, absolutely perfect Madonna is this one here. It's called the Madonna of the Magnificat from 1481. This is at the Uffizi. It's in this round format, which is called a tondo. This is a popular format for the time period. This is the mother of all beautiful Madonnas when it comes to Botticelli. It was so beautiful that there were 5 contemporary copies made during Botticelli's lifetime. One of them is at the Louvre, one of them is at the Morgan Library in New York City. So let's talk a little bit about what he's done here. What has he done to make this Madonna so beautiful? Well, first of all, she's got this sort of porcelain white skin. It almost makes her look like a statue in some ways, but there's just a little bit of pink in those cheeks and on her lips, just a very sort of delicate touch here. Her eyes are turned down, but we see some of this golden blonde hair, and it is golden blonde. He is using actual gold pigment in the hair and on other elements throughout this picture, more than he had ever done in any other painting before. She is being crowned as the Queen of Heaven with a golden crown. There's this incredible drapery that is already encircling her head. It's crossed over sort of her clavicles here. And then there's a number of sheer draperies underneath that. She's got these gorgeous, elegant proportions and features. And in this moment, she is writing the words to the Magnificat, which is like a hymn about the Madonna. And notice how her child, the Christ child, is kind of guiding her hand in this moment. So she's gorgeous. And just as a quick sort of tangent, in this wonderful work over here on the right, that was actually painted in 1922 by a pre-Raphaelite artist named Eleanor Brickner, we can see an imagined scenario where Botticelli is in his studio working on this very painting. But in this scenario, the Medici family, the 2 powerful Medici brothers, Lorenzo the Magnificent and his brother Giuliano, have come in to introduce this beautiful young woman named Simonetta Vespucci. And this is a consequential introduction in Botticelli's life because Simonetta Vespucci was said to be his model. A few art historians even allege that she was his lover at one time, but she was certainly the inspiration for many of the most beautiful women that Botticelli painted. So, so we're looking at 2 portrait busts here. We don't know for sure who these women are, but a lot of art historians just sort of ascribe these portraits to being Simonetta Vespucci. Now, she was married to someone else. She was married into the Vespucci family, distantly related to Amerigo Vespucci, the explorer for whom America is named. So, I mean, just incredible social circles in Florence at this time. But with these 2 works, we can see this absolutely gorgeous, idealized, blonde bombshell of a beauty here. Who wouldn't be inspired by her? And apparently the Medici were just absolutely taken with her as well. In these 2 pictures, you can see her in profile, and we can also see just unbelievable adornment in the hair. Now, the hair was thought to be like the ultimate symbol of femininity. It's like the female equivalent to virility. It speaks to just how fertile maybe even that a woman could be, and how alluring, certainly. Believe it or not, in Florence at this time, they actually had laws for how many like pearls and beads women could put into their hair. When we look at these images, we should be reminded of the fact that these women that we're looking at are professionally styled. They would have gone to a hairdresser to get it, looking like this, and they would have had to bleach their hair. Florentine women bleached their hair with an interesting compound that included human urine. That's how you get this blonde in Florence at this time. But all of this hair and all of this adornment would have been considered absolutely breathtaking. You wouldn't have been able to take your eyes off of it. Notice how this woman over here on the left has these 2 braids that terminate right in between her breasts here. The hair is essentially the equal sign for sexuality when it comes to Botticelli. All right, so let's turn our attention to two major works that you've probably seen before and you've probably sort of scratched your head over. These works are so very connected to these blonde bombshells and these idealized beauties that he's been painting so far. This is the painting called Primavera, also known as the Allegory of Spring, from 1482. It's at the Uffizi. It's tempera on panel. It's roughly 6.5 feet tall and 10 feet wide. It's a massive painting, and it's very unusual in the history of Botticelli's work and in the history of art, because nobody was painting mythological scenes like this at this time. Mythological scenes like this hadn't really been painted since classical antiquity. And so there's a lot of choices here that Botticelli made that art historians are still scratching their heads over. We think we've got it figured out too, for the most part, but there are just these wonderful correlations between this work and Botticelli's religious work. For example, notice that this central figure here, who is thought to be a depiction of Venus, the goddess of love, the goddess of beauty. Notice how this relates so nicely to that altarpiece that we'd seen before, where Botticelli is using foliage to create this kind of architectural niche around the Madonna to kind of elevate her. And then we could compare this a little bit further and take this, divine female figure. Here she is over here in sort of a pagan form. Take this divine infant and we see another, chubby, beautiful infant up above. This would be Venus's son, Cupid, or Eros, who is blindfolded and shooting an arrow to make a little mischief and make people fall in love with each other. Another element of this picture, the Primavera, which I think sort of interestingly relates to some of Botticelli's religious work, is how Venus is standing here with this kind of unusual pose, this kind of flexed wrist. And it sort of reminds me of that unusual gesture that we saw with Botticelli's Annunciation over here. Certainly not a one-for-one comparison, but it's a strange pose nonetheless, especially if you live in the age of carpal tunnel syndrome. So let's head back to Primavera total to sort of figure out what the meaning is in this very kind of complex composition here. Generally speaking, art historians think of this picture as being about love, peace, prosperity. It almost certainly was created as a wedding gift, but for who and when, it's all still unknown. It seems like it's sort of a dark picture because they are in this forest. It's actually an orange grove. Oranges were the symbol of the Medici family because oranges were said to have medicinal property, but the painting has aged over time and darkened over time. So in addition to the oranges, we do see this kind of abundance of flowers and plant life here. Believe it or not, art historians have been able to definitively identify more than 130 different species that Botticelli kind of carefully rendered in this painting here. So he went to great lengths to create this masterpiece that we all know so well. And what for? Well, in this case, it's probably to reinforce that notion of fertility that would be so important to a painting that you would give somebody to celebrate their marriage. So now let's turn our attention to the characters in this painting. They are sort of spread across in the foreground here, almost as though they're like on a stage setting here. They are all very bright compared to this dark setting, but there are no shadows. They almost seem to be hovering in this space. They don't seem fully integrated in it. We only have one or two figures that seem to be behind anything. So we're actually going to start over here on the right to read this painting from right to left. All right, so we already know we've got our Venus, we've got our Eros over here. What's happening on the right. How do art historians understand what's happening here? We see a blue guy flying in. He seems to be grabbing this woman who's got a plant coming out of her mouth. And then all of a sudden, there's this beautiful woman in flowers who just seems to be so serene. So what is this? Well, art historians have decided that this is probably a representation of the god Zephyr, the god of wind. And he's important to the story of springtime, which is what this is all an allegory of, and springtime and pollination, because he's blowing seeds around. So in this moment, he has captured this young woman who's understood as sort of an allegory of named Chloris, a little nymph named Chloris. And as he's captured her, he's essentially spread his seed, for lack of a better term, and we can see she's bringing forth plant life. Now, notice for a moment her pose, because this will become important too once we get to the Bonfire of the Vanities. And notice too this incredible diaphanous drapery that she's wearing. Art historians believe that she then becomes Flora, the allegorical figure representing flowers in springtime, and she is striding forward in this floral dress. With blossoms cradled in her skirt here, and just sort of throwing these blossoms around. On the other side of this painting, we have four characters, also equally mysterious in this case. These are the three graces, and they are virtues, sort of like Venus, but they represent chastity, pleasure, beauty, and they're doing this dance where each one of them is sort of giving and receiving equally. They are all stunning beauties in their own right. There's a thought here that that Simonetta Vespucci might have posed for this particular grace over here. Notice that Cupid up above is aiming at them. One of them is about to fall in love. This figure over here is said to be Mercury, the god of May, also related to springtime, but also the messenger of the gods. And here he is using his staff to sort of stir up some clouds, stir up a little bit of weather. So on this end, sort of related to wind, related to the pollination of seeds, and throughout this picture, this idea of equating human reproduction with all of the flowering and the beauty of springtime. So we have this incredible and sort of unusual depiction of the mythological past with these gorgeous blonde bombshells in it. And now we turn our attention to the ultimate mythological blonde bombshell. That brings us to the Birth of Venus, painted in 1485. This is also at the Uffizi. It's painted on canvas. It's 5.5 feet tall and over 9 feet wide. So here we see the myth of the birth of Venus, who is born of sea foam. And in this retelling of the story, we have Botticelli showing us another wind god who is blowing her to shore on this giant scallop shell here. And then this nymph-like figure who is bringing a cloak over to the nude Venus. So we're going to take all of this apart, but I wanted to just relate this back to some of Botticelli's religious painting. There's like a root for everything, right? We talked before about those sacred conversation paintings, those altar pieces. Look at the scallop shell over Mary here. It's as though he just flipped it over so that the Venus would have something to ride in on. Incidentally, scallop shells are not that big. This is an imagined scallop shell. It also reminds me of his depiction of the angel Gabriel and that incredible message of Mary's divine pregnancy that he is delivering here, what with these rays of golden light coming out of his mouth. In this case, this god of the wind is blowing these straight lines, these little representations of air out of his mouth as well. He also is a winged male figure hovering above the ground, just as the angel Gabriel is here too. So there's a lot here that relates to the religious work. It's all, part of Botticelli's bag of tools that he goes back to again and again. But of course, the showstopper when it comes to this painting is the depiction of the Venus herself. And really, up until this painting was created, there hadn't been a life-size female nude painted like this since classical antiquity. This was a revolution for the time, and it must be said too that this was not painted as a religious picture. This isn't a depiction of Eve. He's not trying to tell us a moral or educate us with this picture. This is a picture about pleasure. This is a picture of Botticelli prompting us to think about sexuality too. I mean, we talked a little bit before about the hair and how important hair is in Florentine paintings and portraits at this time. Venus's hair is unbelievable. It's, you know, it's floating in this wind, and it's so incredibly long that she holds it over herself, holds it over her pubic area, and then it sort of stands in for hair down there as well. So so there is this exaggerated femininity to this figure, but also really unusual proportions too. She has this unusual giraffe-like neck that we see here, these slouching, almost invisible shoulders, large forearms, very long arms that seem to go on, but also look at her legs. It's as though there's like, you could almost draw a line right here at her hips, and her upper body seems upright, her lower body seems like it's about to fall over. Now, importantly, Botticelli would have been looking at precedents from the classical past, most specifically the Medici's sculpture of the modest Venus type from classical antiquity, where we can see the beautiful representation of the goddess of love, the goddess of beauty, where she is modest. She's hiding herself. It's a pose that makes a voyeur out of us all. We get to gaze upon somebody who is suddenly aware of their own nudity. This sort of swaying pose that she has here, this sort of off-balance pose, might have also come from Gothic sculpture, from a work like you see over here on the left. So a lot of different precedents sort of filtered into this one magnificent mythological work over here. We don't know too much about the birth of Venus. There's still a lot of dispute about it, but we know that this is a beauty here that is so alluring. It makes this painting timeless in certain ways. So in our last 10 minutes, let's focus on what changes here. And things certainly begin to change for Botticelli. We go away from these bombshells to something else. And it really starts off with the Medici. Once again, we have already been introduced to Lorenzo the Magnificent. This is his brother Giuliano. And this is a portrait of Giuliano that's in the National Gallery of Art. There were many of them made because Giuliano was unfortunately the victim of an assassination. Lorenzo's life there was also an attempt on Lorenzo's life at that same moment, but he escaped. There was essentially a giant conspiracy to oust the Medici from Florence, which you can imagine would provide or create a lot of instability in this city that has kind of relied on this family for so long. So that happens at the end of the 1470s, and throughout the 1480s, there are these revolts against the Medici until finally they go into exile, and it creates this power vacuum. And this vacuum is filled by this man here, who we see in a portrait by an artist named Fra Bartolomeo. The person that we're looking at is named Fra Savonarola, and he is a religious reformer. He comes into power kind of condemning the worldliness of the city. He is obsessed with human wickedness, and he detests practically every form of pleasure and relaxation. You can imagine he is a man who is totally at odds with the art world. So the next few images I'm going to show you are images of Savonarola that were created years after his death. These are artists' imaginings of his power and of his influence. So just to give you a sense in terms of Savonarola's influence, he almost became this moral dictator in Florence at the time when the Medicis were ousted, and he made this reputation of really sort of telling people to get rid of things that related to this idea of worldliness. So he was like a hellfire preacher. He disapproved of jokes, of frivolity, of poetry, of sex, certainly, of gambling, fine clothes, jewelry, anything like that. So he was denouncing art. He actually apparently denounced some of Botticelli's artwork, and then he began to tell people to burn these possessions. This is a little bit tough to see, but it's a relief carving where you can see this huge fire here. And the people of Florence, who were his followers, would come together for these huge bonfires, these bonfires of the Vanities, where they would throw in things like mirrors, paintings, manuscripts, one-of-a-kind works of art, and burn them because Savonarola was telling them that they were wicked. And he had so much sway and so much influence that even people who weren't his followers, like maybe these people over here, their hands were forced by Savonarola's sort of cult of people who were so invested in what he was preaching. So we can't even imagine how much was lost to these bonfires of the Vanities, of musical instruments, books, paintings. It was all burned. Well, a lot of it was burned during this time. And and probably not surprisingly, because he was preaching against wealth, essentially. People who were in power decided that Savonarola was a little too dangerous. And so he was brought to trial himself for sedition, for essentially being a heretic. And he was sentenced to death at the age of 45. So the year is 1498. Botticelli is still alive and well. He's living in Florence. And this is a painting, not by Botticelli, of Savonarola's public execution, where he was burned at the cross here. So a public execution like this would have had a huge impact on Savonarola's followers. And from what we know, Botticelli was one of his followers, and he probably kind of internalized a lot of these teachings over the course of the last few decades of his life. So we're going to see how that impacts his paintings. And we have the pleasure now of going to a local museum, fairly local for most of us, and that is the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. She collected several Botticellis, and one of them was created right after the Bonfire of the Vanities. It's a smaller scale work than many of the works that we've been looking at, and it was probably also made for a wedding. So this is the Tragedy of Lucretia. It was painted in 1500, so just a few years after Savonarola's death. And what we see here is another story in multiple parts. In this case, it's the story of an honorable woman. It's the story of Lucretia, who we see here 3 times in this green dress. While her husband is away, the virtuous Lucretia is raped by the king's son. You can see this man in armor over here with a knife. Her husband comes home and discovers her unconscious. In order to save her honor, when she awakens, she takes her own life. And then we can see that these soldiers are sort of agitating at this unjust death. Imagine getting this as a newlywed and imagining what this means for you as a bride here. So there's these bigger stories about, the fall of Rome and that sort of thing. But notice here that he's still using the kind of storytelling that he was using 20 years earlier at the Sistine Chapel. We even have this reference to the classical past through the use of the architecture of the Arch of Constantine here. But the figures are so different. they're tiny, they're acidic, they're agitated. Everybody is in these tense, clenched poses. Everybody seems like they're flying at each other. And you can see a similar aesthetic in this sister work to the Tragedy of Lucretia. Very similar, also probably a wedding gift. This is the story of Virginia, a similar story where we can see her here. She was, if I'm remembering correctly, she was kind of publicly, I guess her honor was publicly violated over here. She's brought before a judge who says he's going to make her a slave. And then to save her honor, to save her dignity, her father steals her away and kills her. So once again, this is a very precarious position any bride is going into with a gift like this. But once again, we see these tiny, agitated figures. We see Botticelli trying to tell a very clear and sort of hellfire moral lesson with his paintings. His religious paintings, in this case, the nativity scene, are also almost confounding and dark at this point in his life. This is his mystical nativity. This is in the collection at the National Gallery in London, painted in the year 1500. This is really different from his other images that are related to the birth of Jesus, where usually we see this kind of quiet moment between Mary and Joseph, and maybe a few people coming to bring gifts. In this case, we have angels singing, dancing, encircling the scene, and we even have angels kind of fighting and devils coming out of these rocks in the foreground. In the text up above, he's actually referencing the apocalypse. He's referencing passages of Revelation here. So his mentality is in a completely different place towards the end of his life. We even see that his devotional images of the Madonna and Child have changed remarkably. We no longer have these otherworldly, heavenly depictions of idealized beauties. Here we see something that is a little bit more naturalistic, I would argue, and with a great deal more pathos in the face. She looks like a real person that you might encounter, as opposed to a glamour shots version of a woman. So we'll end with this influence of the Bonfire of the Vanities with Botticelli's painting Man of Sorrows, a very late work for him, probably dating to about 1510, the year that he passed away. This is in a private collection. Now, images like this are usually opportunities for artists to accentuate Christ's physical suffering from the crucifixion. And in this case, Christ's hands are tied. We see the wounds, the stigmata wounds. We see blood from the crown of thorns, but Botticelli is still kind of struggling with who he is as a storyteller. This Christ still has beautiful curls coming over his shoulders, but a face that's sort of twisted in anguish. The angels encircling his head are holding the instruments of his torture and of his execution. But with an image like this, I feel like we get all of the turmoil that Botticelli is feeling in these final days of his life. So as we wrap up with his legacy, I don't think we can overstate exactly how much of an influence that he's had on the art world and the world at large. With the image over here on the left, we can see the surrealist artist Magritte fully appropriating images or figures from Botticelli's paintings into his own works. Over on the right, we can see a 10-cent euro here with the famous Venus featured here. Women today are still trying to capture these beautiful mermaid curls that Botticelli captured way back before the year 1500. And there seems to be sort of evergreen interest in acquiring these works. A Botticelli portrait just sold for $92 million at auction here, and that was just last year. That is the highest price paid for an old master painting, I think, in the past 5 years. So he's really kind of considered the best of the best when it comes to old master paintings. And that is maybe why we have climate activists today who use works like Botticelli's work here as sort of a springboard for their protests. In this case, two people glued themselves to to the masterpiece Primavera in the Uffizi. Incidentally, they just glued themselves to the glass, but it got in the news, and their hope, of course, is that it prompts more questions and thinking and conversations about climate change. So if you feel like you can't get enough Botticelli, I've got good news. He's coming to us. He's coming to America, at least to Minneapolis, if you have an excuse to go there in the next few months. Beginning in October, there's going to be a pretty expansive Botticelli exhibition with like 45 loans from the Uffizi, so that should be really great. So we'll wrap up with just this acknowledgement, this awe-filled acknowledgement that we probably could not have gotten from the Gothic era to the High Renaissance. Works like this sorrowful Madonna to the Mona Lisa without Botticelli and these beautiful linear portraits of blonde bombshells, mythological figures, and these gorgeous Madonnas along the way. He played a very critical role there. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you might have about Botticelli. Start looking at the chat here.
Yes, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll read them to Jane and have her answer them. So we have one from Cora. She says, I wonder what the impact has been on idealized beauty.
Okay, I wonder what the impact has been on idealized beauty. Oh, that's probably like at least a whole other hour, right? Cora, I'm not sure if you're speaking specifically to in our culture today, but certainly an image like the birth of Venus has set an unbelievably high standard in certain ways for what we think of what we think to be is beautiful. It's also a really strange painting because I feel like it's one that's sort of ubiquitous, but it's also one that we don't carefully look at. And every time I look at this detail that's right here, I notice that her eyes are uneven, that there's one that's sort of slanted downwards. And that's true for so many of his Madonnas, actually. So I think he sort of sets this high standard, but upon closer examination, they kind of start coming apart a little bit. So he kind of introduces us to idealized beauty, but even in itself, it's a little bit imperfect. So I hope that sort of gets to what you're asking. It's a fascinating question, and like I said, probably could use a whole other hour on its own too. And I'm seeing some of the kind words that people have written in too. I appreciate that so much.
Yes, and people have been asking if this is recorded. So just to reiterate, yes, this has been recorded, and it will be up on the library's YouTube page within the next couple of days.
Right. And I didn't mention, I don't think, what Culturally Curious is. This is a company that I own that is an arts education consulting firm, but it specializes in art appreciation programs like this one. So if you had a good time tonight, you can always go to my website, which is iamculturallycurious.com. And I have listed links to a number of free presentations like this one on various subjects. Botticelli is my my featured talk for the month, so I'm giving it a few more times in the next week or so. But I'm also giving talks on, my other one coming up is called Secret Stories Behind the World's Most Iconic Paintings. That's a really fun one. And I have about 40 or 50 different programs, so you can always check back to the website and see what else is upcoming.
And I believe you have also done a couple other of these presentations for the library that you have also graciously allowed us to record as well. And those are also up on our YouTube page if anyone is interested. I believe, did you do one on Georgia O'Keeffe? Is that the one that I think was the last one? Yes. Okay. And I think there might have been one other person, but it's escaping me right now who it was.
Thanks for mentioning those, Amy. So it looks like I might have blown you away with a lot of information tonight, maybe no more questions for this evening. But what I always love to tell people is that if you have questions after the fact, comments, or corrections, please feel free to get in touch with me. I always love to talk to people. And you too, Merritt.
I know, he wants his food. Well, thank you everyone for coming out, and especially to you, Jane, for taking time out of your busy schedule to do this presentation. This was wonderful. I learned so much, and I'm like, don't look at art the way you do. So this was very eye-opening to me, and I loved seeing and like exploring all these artworks and learning like a little more about them. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Again, as you're leaving, if you could fill out that survey, that would be wonderful. In the meantime, I guess everyone have a great night.
Good night, everyone. Take care.